It's a thing. Come to work.
Hope it doesn't rain.
Yeah, I was looking at the weather, I don't think it is. He thought it was gonna snow, I didn't see anything.
Yeah, it was on
That was it.
well, I drove on
Weather.
Tuesday.
It's dusting a little right
Yeah, they're talking about snow
time.
on Sunday.
there.
Just pray it doesn't snow Sunday because it can't snow.
7 to 8.
Oh, no.
Okay, we'll get started on a few things, before we hit the main event. Just a few things, traffic this weekend due to the wake of a, local man who's a, New York, police, in the New York Police Department, had a tragic end to his life, and, so the, wake will be on Friday 4 to 8, and then the funeral is Saturday at 9:30. We're expecting a lot of people, coming to it because it's a, New York policeman, and, his history with the Sheriff's Department and North Highlands Fire, and their families have long standing in the village also. So anyway, I just wanted to give everyone a little heads up that during the hours, probably Friday towards the 4 to 8, I think is the wake, and also Saturday 9:30, expect a lot of traffic, and maybe stay home if you're not going to the funeral, or walk there because, you know, Larry Burke, our officer in charge, is expecting, you know, a lot of people, and it could be congested, and so the less people we have on the sheets, the better. So anyway, sad news there, and just be aware, everyone, of that. Let's see, so getting on with our agenda tonight, we have correspondence, a request for a 30-day notice for a liquor license for Masonry Vernacular, the Old West VFW Hall. This is something we've done in the past. This goes to a liquor, they have to go through all the same requirements with the State Liquor Authority. So I'll make a motion to approve the request.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
It appears as if there's a request for the board to write a letter in support. The one thing I would note is that the third paragraph, this is not an active restaurant that is being purchased, so I would not, in your letter to the, in support, I would not include that. It says, please note that no client is.
Yeah, no, I see that.
And may I just say one thing, that if people are applying for a liquor permit, expect a 30-day wait. I don't think in the whole time I've been here, I've seen these requests made 30 days prior to when they hope for. You know, all we get are waivers for the
Right.
30-day notice. And I think people should comply with that requirement. I mean, I'm willing to.
Although we have approved, I think we did Beer and Brew, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
thought we.
Yeah, all of them.
I know, we have approved a lot of them
Mhm.
that have come before us, you know, these requests to waive the 30-day
Mhm.
notice. I just don't think we should get in the habit of it.
You know, I agree with
I mean, the
you.
30-day advance
Yeah.
notice is there for a reason,
Mhm.
so.
No, I agree with Lynn. But, you know, 30 days is not that long. If they apply for 30 days in advance of when they need it, then we don't have to do this.
Okay, noted. Next, request to waive a water sewer late fee from Rebecca Sperling, who reached a mix-up with her account. She's said to check out her solid record of paying promptly. I'm not gonna dispute that. The penalty amount was a huge $14.24 or 9 cents.
39 cents.
So I would make a motion to waive the late fee for Ms.
Second.
Sperling. Any discussion?
No.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next, I'd like to set a date for the 4th of July celebration so we can start planning and calling and doing a few things. One where you'd be working with the Putnam County Historical Society. They have a little group that's meeting, so I have attended one meeting, which was just preliminary, but it's the bicentennial for the Foundry, so working with them. There's also the Hello Dolly celebration going on this year, so there's a lot going on. It should lend itself to a really good parade and a lot of time and efforts from a number of different groups, which was lacking last time. We had a lot of people, but most of them the same people. So this year we did put something out and haven't received any replies. You know, we requested, you know, people who are interested in the 4th of July celebration.
We got one.
We got one, sorry. We got one, so we might put that out again, or we do have a few that I've tapped, so they would join. And so if we do join with them and the parade, one thing we were talking about at the meeting just briefly was like having music or whatever and calling West Point, since it's West Point Foundry. Fran had talked to West Point today regarding the time for their fireworks, and I think they offered or said, would we like a band of some sort? So they're having their celebration on the 7th, so we probably wouldn't get it for the 7th. So our thought at this point is there's nothing else that's really got us there. 4th of July is on a Wednesday, so the prior Saturday is June 30th. And so my suggestion is to go with the 30th in hopes that we can get the West Point Band to enhance the parade. Any thoughts
sounds like
from
fun.
everyone else?
I thought last year we kept it on the 4th because it was the 4th celebration.
So you want to have it in the middle of the week on Wednesday?
Well, last year it was on a Tuesday. But the logic that we used in putting it on July 4th was because it was July 4th.
Well, I don't think the other, I don't think that the Historic Society would be willing to do it on a Wednesday.
Well, there's two things, right? There's the West Point Foundry celebration, and then there's the village's July 4th celebration.
Yes, and the July 4th celebration would be in tandem with.
Okay, so what you're suggesting is that they be coincident, that they be on the same day?
Yeah, I think that there could be, you know, participants in the parade that had to do with the West Point Foundry. The West Point Band, or cannon being drawn by horses was one of the things from the, you know, the original Parrot gun and things that they're working on like that. So I'm thinking a weekend would be better in this case.
Okay.
Lynn?
Well, I've always been in favor of celebrating the 4th of July on the 4th of July because it's my birthday. But since Wednesday is awkward to include these other people who would like to add to the quality of our celebration, I'm not opposed to doing it on a different day.
Steven?
I have no problem with whatever you guys say.
You gonna wait?
You don't think a Saturday or a week there would be any difference?
Well, you make a good point. People are gonna be doing all this extracurricular stuff, then, you know, it would probably be more convenient to have it for them on a weekend. So, I like it on the 4th of July, but I really,
I mean, I can ask them, I imagine that they are having other events and they're trying to coordinate it with a parade and events at the Foundry and other locations in the village.
so I mean, maybe talk to them and see what they're planning on.
Well, they're having another meeting tomorrow night, which either I or Marie will be attending, so we can ask them that.
I love the idea of the West Point Band playing here for us. They're great.
I guess that's another thing we should find out tomorrow. Okay, so do you wanna set it at, well, we can entertain both dates, but I'd like to, you know, let the committee tomorrow night know. And if they don't wanna have it in the middle of the week, I say we go for June 30th.
Okay.
Okay, if
Yep.
they're like, if they think that's fine and that's a good date, then. And
We
we'll
can
have,
call it the 4th of June 30th.
okay. Well, we have
That's my input.
Oktoberfest in September.
Right. The 4th of June 30th.
Right, okay. And Christmas stuff is now out in Walmart, so.
And then a rain date, if we need it, will be July first, right? Sunday.
Yeah.
How are the,
Well, depending on the
fireworks?
date, we'll either have, July first,
Yeah,
or if we do have it on the fourth, if they have no objection and we go with the fourth, then
then what do you do for rain date?
then we have it the next Saturday or Sunday?
Because West Point's is Saturday.
Alright, so we could have a Sunday, set it for that Sunday?
I think it was, Marie, wasn't there an issue last year that we questioned about people who have food for the event, and then if we have a rain date that's not like the exact next date?
Rain dates are problematic for anybody that does the food. Why not have it on the Saturday, instead of the Sunday, June 7th instead of, June 8th?
July seventh?
Rain date, yes, July, thank you.
Because, West Point's having theirs on July seventh.
Oh, I see, yeah.
I mean, we could, I don't know if we can get a smaller version of a band, or if their whole band plays at theirs, cause that's a big night for them. And if we wanna gear our event to the fact that we do or do not get a band from West Point.
Well, I guess the question is, one of the questions is, for the West Point Foundry celebration, would they entertain the idea of a rain date, given the preparations that they're making and the number of organizations that they're probably inviting? I'm wondering if they have flexibility on the date, but we'll find out more.
I know they have a variety of things throughout the months leading up. Do they have a specific bunch of things on around the 4th of July?
I thought that they were looking for specific groups to march for the
Okay.
parade.
Mhm.
I think we should call it June 30th. It's a Saturday, it gives us a weekend, it gives a lot more flexibility for people in their time. Let's set it for July,
Yeah, I'm
June,
good for
June
June
30th, and rain date the following day, Sunday, regardless of whether we get a band or anything. I'm gonna skip to 4 and 5, and they're quick, and, so, or unless you're not ready, are you ready?
No, I'm ready.
Okay.
The date,
Yeah.
sorry, is there gonna be any motion about the date, or it's just an item for discussion right now?
Well, we're gonna set the dates. I'll make a motion to hold the July 4th celebration on June 30th with a rain date of July 1st.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Approval of bills?
I move to approve batch number 4460 for an amount of $23,483.88.
I'll second. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we have minutes, approval of minutes of, January 9th, 2018. I'm sorry, I'm looking for that. Okay, it's a village board meeting, board of trustees. I'll make a motion to approve.
Second?
Discussion?
In the, one comment in, first page, resolution 01-2018, Mayor Morandi made a motion to adopt the resolution, as opposed to Mayor Morandi made a resolution.
Anything else?
Just one change, it's on page 5, the approval of bills, batch 4437, the total amount is 38,831.91, not 99.
Let me get to that place, I'm sorry,
Sorry,
Fran.
Michael. Page 5, near the bottom,
Which page, I'm sorry?
page 5.
Fingers aren't working.
You need one of these.
Okay, and which amount was,
Batch 4437, the total amount is 38,831.91, not 99.
What do I, Fran?
Thank you.
okay,
Okay, thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Approval of, January 10th meeting, Village Board of Trustees. I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Michael. Next is a review, chapter 64. When last we met, there were a lot of questions that were popping up, not a lot of time to discuss them, and I believe there's been feedback on those and modifications. I don't know where we should start with that. I guess most of the questions were from Marie, so I guess Marie, are you satisfied or have further questions with the answers that we received?
I'd like to first thank the HDRB. Their response was very thorough and very helpful in understanding why they came up with what they did. In the preamble is 6.64-1. We recommend that this section be broken down a bit, and I like that concept. So there'd be a preamble from the original, chapter 64, and then a preamble from the new, modification, to chapter 64. It would be interesting when you've done that to see what it says. So just, I think it's a good idea. It would, and I trust that you will, I know that you will do a great job on that. I do appreciate the fact that much of what my comments addressed were original words from chapter 64 from 40 years ago. In the findings 64-1B, the findings and enabling authority.
You can continue, I'm gonna go get my chapter 64 papers, which I left in the other one.
I agree with general good welfare. It's health and safety.
Well, Marie, that comes out of, and this is something that you should discuss with the village attorney, that comes out of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and common law.
I'm opposed to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution.
So
Wasn't there.
preservation as part of land use law, it's derived from the police power under the 10th Amendment.
Okay.
And that is standard language,
Okay.
and there is both Supreme Court decision making around Grand Central, and lots of other case law supporting that. So that's sort of standard in.
Okay. In public policy, I like the, I'm fine with economic benefits. In fact, if I remember back to when this was originally implemented, one of the strong selling points was the preservation, if not the improvement to property values, therefore economic value. So I'm fine with that. For 64-1C,
Christ.
It's time for new chair.
That's it. These chairs are going out the door tomorrow.
What do you see as the enforcement for this? Would this be the code enforcement officer?
For property maintenance?
Yeah.
Yes.
So how does the code enforcement officer get made aware of a problem, a maintenance problem for properties in the district? I don't know how it occurs now, other than people will call and complain. But going forward, where our code enforcement officer is full-time, almost full-time in the office, with visits to various properties that have to be inspected, the code enforcement officer is not driving around as much as the previous code enforcement officer was, and so has less visibility to some of the maintenance problems that exist within the district. Is the expectation that the public would continue to call the village office or the code enforcement officer when they observe what they think is a maintenance problem or one of safety, in relative to a property in the districts.
Well, I think that is the way enforcement issues have customarily been addressed in a small village with limited staff, is
Okay,
contact to the building department from either
the public.
the public or members of the administration, whatever that might be. I don't know how that would be different necessarily unless someone were going door to door. I mean, there are, other municipalities do have within their zoning codes, they do have exterior property maintenance laws. You know, especially in places where they're like college towns, where there are concerns about couches on the front porch or in the front yard and these sorts of issues, right?
Or
There's
gated communities or something
or
like
gated
that.
communities like this, sure, things where people have very particular concerns about exterior maintenance, when the garbage is pulled back in and that sort of thing. And that also, it's
It's up to the
enforcement
public.
driving around, but it's also a system of complaint,
Okay.
as it were.
For 64-1 C 3 and 4, can we try to find a different term? The term that was used in the text in that section was the village, and the village includes both properties in the district and properties not in the district. And I had asked if the text could be reworded to talk about the district as opposed to the village.
Well, in the case that you have we do not currently have individual landmarks outside of the district, but there is the potential for that.
Right. So could it say something like the district and, covered cultural artifacts, or something like that? What my concern is here is that the wording is expansive.
Well, the thing to keep in mind is that the code that we cite is a state code,
Mhm.
which applies to all the buildings,
Mhm.
not just the district.
I'm
This
just
is under
worried.
public policy and the purpose of the local law. That we've moved out of the maintenance discussion. 64-1 C 3 and 4.
Right.
I'm just going
Well, C1 is where we cite the New York State property maintenance code, which is the New York State code.
We're beyond that, we've just finished with that.
So C1-3 is to ensure the harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth and development of the village. And 4 is to enhance the visual character of the village by encouraging new design and construction that complements the village's historic resources. I'm just gonna, for my own memory jog, pull the previous language.
Okay, I see what you mean. So,
To point 4, I can say that we've been when looking at new construction and additions to things and precedent that can be set for similar design motifs and things like that, we've been paying attention to relevant things inside the district that it can relate to, and also things that are not necessarily inside the district but inside the village, because not every historic building in our village is inside of the district. So specifically in the way that it's used in point 4, we're talking about new design that complements the village character as a whole, not specifically just the
Good point.
district
I
character.
think that, going back to Marie's point, I think the fear is that the historic district review board is going to overstep their authority into places outside of the district and try to apply, regulations from this code.
We can't, things aren't referred to us from
But that's sort
outside.
of the way this sort of reads, and, you know, in the future, when people are not you guys sitting there, you know, that may be the interpretation that they're getting from it.
So what language do you think would address that issue?
I mean, I agree back to Marie's comments that it should
So could,
Should say
Thank you.
district as
So,
opposed to village.
given the comment that you just made, I accept that that's a very valid use of the word village in C four.
Mm-hmm.
In C three, can we change the word village there to of the districts?
I don't have any objection to that, because I think that what Sean's trying to address is addressed more, directly in number 4.
Got it,
If anyone else has a comment?
okay, agreed.
But on 3, it's really, I don't wanna drag this one out, it'll be all night, but it's not really, it's saying to enhance the visual character of the village. And that's what it's doing, it's not saying you're changing, so it can be, the district, for example, I believe on Fishkill Road, is that in the historic district, Fishkill Street, or
Fisher
where they
Lane.
just did, the Kapoors?
Yes,
Okay, well, the other side of the street isn't or is?
it jogs there.
Or
Some of
whatever,
the street
but-
is, some isn't.
But any work that's done there is enhancing the village. It doesn't mean it has to enhance a district specifically. Is
That work in the
right?
district enhances the
I mean,
village
if I'm
overall.
reading 3, I mean, I feel that by, the work the HDRB does, it doesn't have to, I mean, the work that you do enhances the village as a whole. And it can enhance a neighboring, a house or property that's 1 block away or whatever,
But
so.
can they stop an owner of a house that is not in the district from doing something they wanna do? Because it's
No,
not within
you
the-
can't
We
do
don't
that
have
unless
legal
it's in the
purview to do
district.
Well, that's.
And it's not up for interpretation if somebody comes in, I would imagine an applicant.
Adjacent to us.
Fran, to clarify, if, for example, the only place that would kick in is if there were a project classified type 1 that was substantially contiguous to the district. So, for example, someone decides to do a demolition just beyond the boundary of the district, and the planning, we don't have purview over it, but the planning and zoning boards would have approval, would have purview over it for looking at the redevelopment, and they classified it a type 1. Once it's classified a type 1 and that property is substantially contiguous to the boundary of our district, then the Historic District Review Board would be an agency that would comment on that application, but it would not be, we couldn't be lead agency on that, it's not in the district. We wouldn't have standing to have lead agency on that. So we could comment, but we couldn't take over that process if it weren't in the district. Do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean, I just.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm okay with 4 being left as village. I'd like to see 3 restricted to the district.
I'm
My-
fine
my
with
opinion.
3.
You fine with the change to 3 or leaving 3
I'm
as is?
fine with 3 as it is.
Okay, so we have,
So you all have to work that out.
Yep.
I think the change would be great.
okay. So the next one is 64-1-C6. And this is the conflict, sorry. How does the HDRB resolve conflict between preservation and proposed alternate uses? When I think of an alternate use, I think of uses just defined in the zoning code. So use let's take masonry vernacular. Masonry vernacular had been a meeting hall with no, had been used as a meeting hall. Now
Are you
it's
on
being,
5 or 6? It seems like you're on 5.
I'm on 64-1C6.
Right, which doesn't have any conflict. 5 has, it didn't resolve conflicts between.
Oh, and mine it's,
Yeah, no, this one after this,
mine is 6.
One after that.
yeah, this is the next.
Okay.
So,
I'm working
so
up
in
my
that
homework,
case,
sorry.
it's not looking at use in the way that the zoning board looks at use.
Okay, okay.
It's looking at things like, so for example, with masonry vernacular, things we talked about that looked at the surrounding district, that changed use in the context of the surrounding district was how was the lighting handled on the site?
Okay.
Um,
So, the, in my mind, when I see proposed alternate uses, I think of zoning use, so, restaurant, retail, residential, commercial, etc. So, here is between the preservation of historic resources and proposed alternate uses.
So it might be, what that attempts to describe is, for example, a house, well, now we've just had the reverse. The Montessori school was turned back into a residential use. But imagine, a house in the reverse being turned into a school or some other institutional use. And the modifications to the structure that would need to be made to make that use possible would have not only zoning use impacts, but visual impacts on the structure.
Right, well, it may or may not.
It may or may not.
Right.
Someone else feel free to hop in at any
The
point.
thing that is of concern here is change of use, which is the way I'm interpreting this, is change in use. Change in use should not be, the approval of change in use is not the purview of the HDRB. That is totally zoning.
Do you have a suggestion as far as an alternate word?
Yeah,
I mean,
I good point. I don't like it, so what can I recommend?
now that you understand what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, I do appreciate the problem. Along with a change in use, there is typically a change in potential requisite change in the structure, potentially for an exterior.
Or how about proposed changes?
I think the term that we use is alterations, so we can just say proposed alterations.
Proposed alterations is fine. It gets away from the concept of changing the use of the structure.
You wanna get away from land use to.
Yes,
Got it.
and leave it
Alternate
within
zone.
those things that you are properly focused on. Okay. The next one is 64(1)(C)(8). I applaud this. I think that is the right thing to do. I guess what I've seen though, and I have observed the expansion of the application of HDRB concepts to such things as solar panels, and I applaud that. You are adopting, and you are not adopting, but you are incorporating new technology into the way you evaluate proposed changes. That is great. What bothered me here was to conserve valuable material and energy resources. Conserving the materials and the energy resources, I'm not sure what you had in mind there. Wood from buildings?
Well, so there is a whole body of discussion and work within, at the state level and at the national level, looking at embodied energy in existing structures. And the idea that built buildings that already exist, have within them an energy that must be considered in a calculation of efficiency and resources needed were you to change that use. And this is something that's been around since the days of OPEC, looking at embodied energy. So for example, it would take energy to demolish a building, cart it away, landfill it, right? And yes, the new construction would add the potential for passive house standards and these sorts of things that would also increase energy, but you also have to look at what the impact is of taking down a structure and dumping it in a landfill. So that's,
I'm okay.
Even more than that, there was energy expended in producing the materials of the original construction. There was energy that was expended in constructing it. So an existing building represents a lot of energy that had been expended years ago. But it's for all the reasons that Kathleen said, it seems like it's sort of a flagrant waste of energy to demolish something which can be.
I understand it now. Your explanations have been very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'm jumping ahead now. 64 your response was incredibly helpful. So, jumping ahead to 64-2B2. Historical feature and architectural feature. Can you give me an example of what is a significant historical feature and what is an example of a significant architectural feature?
I would say that a significant historical feature would be something like the monument at the base of the hill on St. Mary's Lawn. It is something which has important historic significance, a monument to lost veterans. It is not something that necessarily has particular architectural, from a design standpoint, architectural significance representing a certain era or epoch.
And as the, sorry.
Yeah, I know the Putnam Museum at one point was contemplating putting on display outside an original parrot gun.
Yeah.
So that would be a historical feature
Another
as opposed
example,
to.
yeah.
Well, and things that I know the Code Update Committee has looked at are things like we have a few hitching posts
Yes.
around the village. We have, in a few locations there are the carriage steps that you would
Yep.
get down on to get out of there aren't many of those. They're not architecturally significant, but they're historically significant.
So, can you, those are great examples that I can relate to, every single one of those. Can you give me an example of a significant architectural feature?
That's
That's not
non-historic?
Yes.
That's simply a significant architectural feature?
Yes, yes.
How about the turret at the corner of Main Street and, the corner building, there's a turret. There are, the cladding, tin cladding on, several of the buildings. That's a significant architectural feature.
Well, we talked about the example that we gave in the document we submitted to you as something being architecturally significant but not necessarily historically significant. So we talked about the M&T Bank, which is not yet 50 years old. It's not architecturally significant from the criteria you would use to look at things that are architecturally significant, but in this village, I mean, it's not historically significant, but architecturally, it's the only one of its kind.
Yeah.
And it represents a period in the village.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Very helpful. So, still in the same section, I'm into grading now, Grading. And this is the first time in I think in the rewrite that I had considered grading to be an element of historic preservation. And you have provided the example of 230 Main Street as where the topography would, the topography was such that grading was an important element in the finished aspect of that structure. I'm concerned that grading as such will become a flashpoint within the village. Other than 230 Main, have there been any other examples where grading was a consideration of the review board?
Well, there are a couple of things to think about. One is that the story of the village is one of grading, right? So dealing with constructing buildings on slopes. So if you look at, someone recently had a picture of Mountain Avenue, which is outside of the district, but nonetheless, it was an old photograph of Mountain Avenue, and the grades have changed substantially to accommodate other construction around that house. It's what had to be done to make architecture work here and give us level floors and all of these things. So it's part of the story. You might think about it in a different way, which is, what if St. Mary's sold the lawn and a project were to go forward where the developer were to say, the only way that I can make this work is I carve out a big chunk. I mean, obviously there's underground water there, we know there are other issues, but the only way I can make this work is if I get rid of this slope, which has functioned as a village green, right, in many ways, and plunk this building here. How do we consider grading? Would we need to consider grading? Probably, and I think it's something that the element of slope on that site is something that is an important visual feature in that portion of the village.
So let me take that particular example. Were St. Mary's to be sold to a developer, the developer that's an R1 district lot, so there would need to be some form of subdivision because it is currently one tax parcel. And that subdivision would come under the planning board. The planning board would review whatever proposal the developer would have in mind, including such things as access road, sewer lines and water lines and blah, 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 blah. Would not that review of the subdivision of St. Mary's Lawn were ever to come to?
That's part of it.
I would think that would become part of,
That's part of it, and the example that you give is a perfect example of what would need to be a coordinated review under seeker, in which the planning board and its site plan issues and the HDRB and its design issues would sit together, just like we're going to do tomorrow night with the planning representatives of the planning board are coming together to sit with us for 126 Main, for site issues that sort of overlap with design issues we're looking at for that structure. So in the same way, there would be comment, I imagine, for a project on the St. Mary's location that would take into account things like the context, and on that site, grading certainly is one. Does anybody else want to
Well,
hop in?
just that we look at grading from a visual point of view, and that's, that's why 230 Main Street is an excellent example. The only reason that we got into that was because it was, if the grading had not been changed, you would have had this large wall of the basement that was then, the thing that you saw from walking down the sidewalk. And, the owner wanted a full basement. They couldn't go down any further. And so, this wound up being a way of dealing with that visually. And so that's the only aspect that we're interested in, is the visual impact. And if you look at a lot of the properties, changing the grading on a lot of properties would change visually how you would perceive the structure.
Moreover, you would be looking visually at how that change of grade would impact adjoining structures visually, not in terms of, say, drainage. The planning board would do the drainage stuff, we would look at the visual aspect, which would be contextual.
I accept that. Thank you. The next one is that I would like to discuss is 64-2B. Kathleen, we skipped over 3 pages.
Excellent.
Leave the room more often.
Almost done.
60, so grading is, I have no problem with grading. 64-2B. And this one I think you may have struggled with as much as I did. It's the stage of construction before final completion. as long as you folks are as concerned about it as I am, I'm fine with that, with however you can deal with it in the document.
Well, at this point, we're saying to you, we've struggled with it, we don't have legal brains, right? The village attorney needs to help with this part.
Okay.
I mean, we spent a lot of time on beneficial occupancy. Carolyn did a lot of research. It's tricky.
Right. John first suggested we looked at the Peekskill Code, which uses this term, and there are other communities in New York State which also use it in the context of historic preservation ordinances, and actually even elsewhere outside of New York State. And it's really hard to define, and so I've found instances of it in non-historic preservation law, which made me understand it better. And basically it has to do with whether you could continue to occupy this building, or whether the action of the HDRB in, for example, denying a certificate of appropriateness made the building non-functional in some way.
If you've consulted with John, I'm good with whatever.
So he'll know the background on what we've
Yeah.
presented to you. The one thing that I think it was Al raised, that is an important thing to ask John, is that he made some specific references.
No,
Or you
that's
raised
what
that
I
issue.
found it.
The state, okay. Currently, there are references to the New York State Fire Prevention and Building Code, and there may be other places in the state code that deal with it better than these. So he needs to have a look at that piece to make sure that the right, either refer more specifically or don't refer specifically.
The next one is 30 versus 50.
No one's gonna fall on their swords over it.
I just,
was going to, what, sorry?
Fall on their swords over it.
I'll fall on my sword,
No.
it's 50.
I'm dying.
and I know you pointed out the code, okay, everything said 30.
Yes.
Yes, I understand, and we did 30 because I had looked at your document and said,
Okay.
okay, so I would prefer that we use 50. It's 30 just seems,
I prefer 50 also.
And that's what the Secretary of the Interior uses, it's what SHPO uses.
thank you very much.
But I will say that if at any time the village board decided that there was some specific landmark that was 30 years old, or even 10 years old, and you wanted to pass a special, exceptional law to landmark a particular building, you could still do that. It would be outside of the HDRB process.
Well, also, the language in the code does give flexibility for exceptions like that. Such properties improvements shall qualify if they are integral parts of the historic district meeting criteria for designation, or are properties of exceptional importance as determined by the review board after a public hearing.
Would that be only in the historic district? Or any
No,
regular
it could be an architectural or historic feature outside of the district, which could be named as a local landmark outside the district.
Who would name?
You all.
So it would
So
have to be
someone-
brought to us by an
So
outside-
someone would make a nomination to the board would review that nomination on its merits, and then the
Our
final
board would be.
Our
The
board.
HDRB would do the
HDRB,
nomination.
and then we pass on the
So
nomination to
someone
you
would
too,
come to you, this building, you look at it, you nominate it to us, and then
Right.
we would.
or whoever's sitting in all of our chairs when that happens.
Yeah, that's what I mean by us. The chairs.
The chairs, the currently crappy wheelie chairs, right?
Is that something that should be identified as before it actually, I would hate to have something, if something came to the board, of demolition or something, and then I think it would be hard to act at that time, to say that this is, then determine it was a landmark or of some historical significance. Is there a way to, preempt that, you know what I'm saying? Like, to have, the way I'm hearing it is that, someone would have to nominate or whatever, make a, bring up a certain property and say that it had historical significance at some point, and if it was outside the district, it would come to us. Is that,
No, it would
If it was outside the district, it would still come to us.
okay,
Because our enabling, this document gives us the ability to designate
Okay.
Well,
Things
prac-
outside of the district as individual landmarks,
As did the
or
old one.
to change, yes, the
Pra-
concept of it, or
practically
change
what-
the boundaries of the district.
Practically, what might happen is, some people wanna protect a particular property that's outside of the district. So they get together a petition, they present it to the village board, and the village board refers it to HDRB to look into it, and then da-da-da, and it goes back to you or whatever.
So, as an aside, there are about 25 historical, cultural artifacts that were identified by the Code Update Committee. Many, I'm gonna say 80%, the old 80-20 rule, probably 80% of them are in the district, not on taxable property. Right, so the hitching posts, the stepping stones are all on the state right-of-way, for 9D, so not all of them, but the ones in front of the corner of Chestnut and Paulding are on the state right-of-way. Those, and so that was one of the reasons why I was paying so much attention to this particular area of the chapter. So, and that goes to 64-6D 2 and 3, where those properties are not owned, they're not on a tax map.
They're still owned by the state, though.
They have an owner, it's just not a tax map parcel.
Correct. They are probably owned by the state. I'm assuming they're owned by the state because I believe that that area is in the state right of way, along 9D, as opposed to the village, because they are not within the sidewalk. So, Dave, the concept here, and we had the Code Update Committee had consulted with the HDRB to see what steps would need to be taken to identify these 25 cultural artifacts as being protected by the HDRB's rules and regulations. The Code Update Committee has not come forward yet to the HDRB with that list of 25. We were going to do a test case to see what it would take to do just one, and to try to gauge the amount of work it would take us to do that, and that hasn't been done yet.
I would suggest that we have some consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office on that, because if it's state property and there is a local landmark within state property, how is that treated? You know, or if by being state property, now, that location, is that local or national register?
On Paulding?
On Chestnut,
Chestnut?
near Paulding.
National.
That's national, okay. So well, if it's national, it's also state right now. It's also state and national register. But how that's treated within a state DOT right-of-way, I think we should consult with them and see how that's treated so that we have more understanding and they're alerted that that is something that's on our radar.
Well, one of an aspect of this whole question, particularly for those landmarks that are on a state right-of-way, is that the Code Update Committee is proposing this change to the village code with the inclusion of those landmarks as an appendix. And the code is being changed to conform with the Department of State's 29 topics to get to the point where the Department of State will approve the LWRP. And the LWRP has state standing, long answer, but it could be very beneficial to the village to get those into, or as part of, as a property or as an element that is protected by the HDRB, in which case, if we can get the LWRP approved by the Department of State, that will have legal standing with both the state and the federal government.
But I think it's even more important for the State Historic Preservation Office in the State Parks
I
Department
understand.
to be aware of those
Your point is a good one.
artifacts.
Yeah.
So that when projects are sent in from DOT and they're reviewing
You know,
them, they're
it sets
aware.
off, it sets off their radar.
Yeah,
Agreed.
But also, just for clarification for the public, things like that aren't something that a member of the public has to wait for a code update committee or an HDRB or trustees to do. Anyone can nominate anything to be named as a local landmark. So if there are things that people are concerned about protecting, they should be coming in and having a chat with us and nominating them.
Well, it would be unfortunate if somebody bought one of these sites with the intention of tearing it down because they're gonna build something there. It's not currently one of these sites. They own this property now, and all of a sudden people want the thing to go on this list. And then it gets nominated to you guys, you give it to us, and then this person is held up over this process. Do you see, could that be a potential downfall, or, I mean, would a list of these potential areas, is this something that someone's working on, or is this just an idea that?
Well, the code update committee is working on it, and we have said to the code update committee, if it's something that you're interested in doing, make the nomination.
That's the point that I was trying to make that Steve, I think,
Yep.
is asking. If someone, it could be too late to like enact a landmark status or a historic status. If somebody buys a piece of property that isn't considered, say somebody buys the M&T Bank, for instance, it's not, it's of historic interest or whatever, so we could consider that a landmark or whatever, so someone could buy that and then they want to tear that down.
Well, it also depends on.
Well, that's already in the district.
Yeah, the M&T Bank's
Well,
already.
it's
Well, I think,
it's the example.
Okay, so say something that's not in the district. I didn't know that was.
yeah, I mean, I think it would be hard, because, you know, the nomination process is not a quick one. I mean, you know, realistically, you have to prepare the nomination, which means you have to gather material, you have to be able to justify why the property deserves being either moved into the district or made a landmark. And so all of that process has to go on, and so I guess it all depends on the timing, and realistically, based on how long the nomination process takes, it's not like it's gonna happen overnight. I mean, theoretically, there could be a conflict because a lot of times real estate development kind of drags on, and they need to get all the permits and everything else, and bells start going off. And it just becomes a question of you know, who finishes their process first.
Well, but, so for maybe a better, an easier to understand local and current example is the Cold Spring Cemetery, right? So there's a proposal to put a cell tower behind it. And the cemetery someone contacted SHPO and nominated the cemetery for listing on the National Register. The staff at SHPO determined that that parcel is eligible for listing. And just being eligible for listing protects that site for now. How that works on the local level, I have to be honest, I'm not sure. I've never been part of a process like that where there was something that was nominated in the face of a threat. It's a question that can be asked of the village attorney. How do we approach that on the local level for a local landmark? And we should probably, you know, if he recommends, there perhaps some language around that should be incorporated here. No, sorry. I'll put a period there.
Once it's nominated, it's now in a protected bubble.
I know it works that
Until we
way.
figure out what we're gonna do with it.
It works.
This guy just spent $3 million on a piece of property or whatever.
It works that way on the state and national registers. I don't know how it could work on the local level. Does anybody else have a better answer? No.
Does it work that way if something is discovered during construction?
I mean, like I'm digging and I discover an archaeological artifact. It depends where it's listed. If you were to do that at
my house, it wouldn't matter.
because you're outside of the district, but if it were, let's say,
Campbell House.
oh, yes, that's a great example. So that's one of the things we're looking at with Seeker is as that parcel is redeveloped, and you're digging in the ground to put in a pool or to lay a new foundation, what potential architectural threat is there? Archaeological threat is there? Are there resources that we need to think about? And in that case, that is very much considered. Thank you. Seeker considers a lot of these things.
Yeah, seeker is a useful tool in this context. It's not the only tool, but it's a useful one.
64-6E, and this is public notice for consideration of designation or delineation. In this context, would delineation mean a change to district boundaries?
I just have to get there. 64-6 what? E?
64-6E is an easy.
Mm-hmm. Public notice for consideration, designation, or delineation, okay?
And I'm focusing here on delineation, because delineation means change in boundary. Would this mean a change to the district boundary?
You asked that question earlier in your comments, and we addressed it there under 64-6Z.
Yeah, I asked the question as to what delineation mean, and you answered it there. And so here I'm asking, does this mean, could I read this, the title of this section as public notice for consideration of designation or change in historic district boundaries?
Yes?
Yes.
Because if someone were to nominate, okay, so for example, the Fishkill Avenue boundary is super weird. I don't know how it ended up the way it is, but it is. We're behind the library. The line jogs all over the place there. So let's say someone were to make a nomination to finish off the block and include all the way to the end. In that case, you would be designating those properties, but you also would be modifying the boundary, the delineation of that corner of the district.
Okay. Is the decision to change the boundaries one that is made by the HDRB, or is it a recommendation from the HDRB to the village board? It's a recommendation.
Goes to the village
To the
board.
board, thank you.
As would an individual designation be.
64-6F, we both struggled with that one, and I'm fine with the way you have it currently stated. You're saying.
We're saying that it would be a good thing to have the village attorney run by again, or maybe talk to NICOM about.
Okay, I've so noted it. So this is a new one. 64-6G. Second sentence.
When the review board has compiled by
Okay.
that
So
one?
Second sentence in there, notice of the public hearing shall be sent by registry not to be on each other, proposed for designation or delineation. I think you need or delineation in the second sentence. It is in the first sentence. I think it needs to be added to the second sentence.
Okay.
And six K. This is a new one, and I'm sorry to spring new ones on you. Upon designation of an historic landmark or modification to the boundaries of the district. What I'm missing here, so going from J to K, I'm missing the statement that, okay, it's in J. I was missing the statement that the mayor and board of trustees would make a decision.
Yeah, it's right here.
And yes, I missed it,
Okay.
my error. So
It says the mayor and the board of trustees shall base their decision upon the recommendation
That's it.
and record presented by the review board.
yes, I'm good.
Okay.
So, going to 64-11,
Signage.
signage. on signage in the last sentence in that first paragraph. Signs erected in the historic district are additionally subject to the requirements of the village code.
Oh, whoops, yep, that was, you said that once before and I just.
And I'm not sure that it's going, yes, I think it should be village code there. Yes.
That was,
Thank
I missed that, sorry, I
Nope.
remember that you said that.
Oh, you're a rotten person. How could you possibly have misspelled? Going to 6411E. The third sentence, and this is not your fault at all. It is possible that the regulations for signage may not be under the zoning chapter 134. The regulations for signage may be under chapter 104.
That's why we didn't put numbers in, because that's in flux for you,
Right.
for the code update.
But it says zoning regulations.
So it's better.
Might it be better to say village code?
Okay. Before you leave signage, are you done with signage or are you still have signage?
We had a public hearing on it, and one of the topics I was gonna bring up to the mayor, when the opportunity presented itself,
Was that a hearing?
was to,
That wasn't a public hearing.
was
Public
to,
meeting, wasn't it?
it was a public hearing, was to bring it forward for a public hearing. That you don't want us to do
I
that.
don't know what you're talking about,
Signage.
but what about it?
Well, the code update committee has gone through and rewritten the regs on signage, extracting it from 134 and putting it in 104. There was always a 104 chapter, which had to do with signs.
Yep.
But it was also sprinkled throughout
Right. So
134.
you're consolidating
And
it.
what we tried to do is consolidate it. So what the code update committee was going to do was propose to the mayor that at some point in the near future, that be brought forward for a public hearing for consideration for adoption into the code.
And did you have any concerns about how our sign section reads?
No.
Okay.
No, and I do appreciate the fact that you are under a different time, you're time boxed very differently than we are.
Well, that's something that I hope we can encourage the trustees to deal with at some point. So the reason that there's an expedited review required is an injunction that results from a lawsuit, the determinations of which, the requirements of the village were not met by the village. This is a long time ago. And so to deal with that, an injunction was placed on the village requiring expedited review of signage, which we can accommodate, and there is sort of a release valve for pressure, which says that if we can't pull together a quorum in 3 days, the person can install their sign, but then at the next available meeting time, the sign will be reviewed and the person may be asked to take down what they've put up. This applies not to non-political signage, right? Not someone putting a support Bob on the front of their house, but signage. Non-free speech signage, advertising. It would be immensely helpful, though, not to have to go through that process of trying to pull together a quorum in 3 days. Sometimes it's not a problem at all, sometimes it's hard. And now that we've addressed, this code update addresses the original issues that the judge wanted addressed at the end of that lawsuit. This ordinance change fixes the things that were asked to be fixed. So I think it's reasonable now to take this back and say, look, we complied, can you please lift this injunction?
I have it noted.
And we've complied for years.
For years.
I have that noted, I think I've got 4 or 5 items for, our council.
Great.
My comments. 64-13, B1.
Fees.
Why did I note that? It looks correct here. Oh, is there a form called the nomination for designation or delineation form?
That's our next on the, next thing on our list.
Okay, great, great. Um, 64, 17A3.
Okay.
Should beneficial occupancy be applied to more than just residential property? 3 says for residential property, but it seems to me that it is more than just, it should be applied to more than just residential property.
Most of what,
Beneficial occupancy
well,
is,
no, most of what the hardship standard refers to is that a property is capable of earning a return on investment,
Mhm.
okay? And that's the subject of like a generation of lawsuits and cases that have gone to the US Supreme Court and elsewhere. It's very difficult to determine a return on investment for someone's single-family home that they've owned for 35 years,
Mhm.
okay? It's not commercial. It's not that type of investment, even though during those 35 years, the value of that home may have gone up and down and up and down and God knows what. And there may have been additional investment in the property in terms of refurbishing it and maintaining it, et cetera. So that many codes, and one of them that refers to beneficial occupancy is the Peekskill Code, that makes a distinction between properties that are in some sort of commercial use, whether it's office or retail or industrial or whatever, versus properties that are not put out for rent in any way, that are not operated commercially in any way.
Your explanation makes sense. The
So
reading,
there's, so it's, otherwise it would be apples and oranges.
I understand and I agree. The way, the structure of the sentence in 3, it's like the cart before the horse. Is there any way that the second phrase can be put first? I mean, I struggled with how to read this, and it was only through
You know
your
what?
explanation, Carolyn, that I was able to understand it.
I think part of this is we looked at this for so long, I didn't understand what you weren't understanding until just now when you said that, and now that I look at how that paragraph could be restructured, I see where you got stuck. So, I mean, the answer is, yeah, now that we've been away from it for a while, we
I
can
think
look at it again.
the way we wrote those 1, 2, and 3 is, we had the parallelism of
For an income producing
for
property.
an income producing property, for a tax exempt property, for a blah, 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 you know.
It was,
So
it was
that's
only when you,
why
it was only when you explained it that I understood it.
Okay, so we'll work on that. Okay.
So it's a syntax problem, it's not a.
Yeah, yes, it's the understandability of that sentence, or the syntax of it. Okay, now the other, my first really big problem was 30 versus 50. My second really big problem is determination of economic hardship.
Yeah.
The document goes to great lengths to identify elements in determining whether or not they're elements to be used to determine economic hardship. I cannot understand how those elements are applied or are not applied. So what would be, I think, very helpful for me to agree with you, and this is, I'm sorry, I'm asking for a test case. Can you do an analysis using your metrics to show why one property is one, and it can be a hypothetical.
It would have to be hypothetical, obviously. we have a laundry list of different
Yes,
things that are to be submitted.
right,
And it's just like if you're going through the environmental assessment forms, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and it's asking you about steep slopes even though you've got a
Flat
property
land.
that's flat as a board.
right.
Or
Right.
that on the waterfront, but you're up on a mountaintop,
Right.
you know, and stuff. There's a whole bunch of things that are NA, not applicable,
Right.
okay? And so as you're going through those things, an applicant would say, but there never was a mortgage on this property, so how can I give you mortgage information, right? Or
So if you could.
I didn't buy this property, I inherited it, or, you know, whatever.
So if you could come up with a hypothetical 100-year-old house in the district, and the house occupies 15% of the land, it's a single-family house.
Why don't you do this? Why don't you, why don't you come up with the question of
Okay,
the property that you'd like us to think about,
Yep.
and then we can think about it, because
Okay.
otherwise we're pulling stuff out of a hat.
yep.
And so come up with the hardest SAT question you can come up with, and we'll look at it. But
We're
know,
good at SATs.
but know
Yes,
this,
thank you
know
are.
this, this is our, we are not, again, we are not real estate attorneys, and we're not real estate agents. This is our best effort based on working with the model ordinance and the advice that John First gave us to date. So this is our best effort, and if it's not quite where you think it needs to be, this is another place where you need to work with him to get it just right. This is what we've got.
And just as with the secret process, we hire planning consultants who take us through the process. This is not something that we would take on our own, and, you know, chances are that we would need a real estate person who would take a look at these criteria that we've listed, and, you know, and it's really a
Would crunch
shopping
the
list.
numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will come up with a hypothetical.
And we will do our best with a hypothetical, understanding that in a normal scenario, that's not how it would work. In a normal scenario, we would take all of the data compiled by the applicant, and we would then, in the same way that we've hired AKRF for 126 Main, and we've hired Voorhees blah 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 on 20
NPD.
the Boulevard, we would go to folks with content expertise to say, walk us through this.
Right.
And what does that do? That takes, that makes sure that it's being done correctly and accurately and fairly for the applicant and for the village, but it also takes away the liability for the village in the same way that it happens in the secret process. You don't want me or Sean telling you that a structure is sound, you want a structural engineer telling you that it's sound, right? Same concept.
Great, I will do that. I have no more comments.
Okay. Oh! Anybody else?
Now, is there a point in that process that we're just discussing that they can take all these, whatever, the fees or whatever you want to call costs to remodel this place, even though it could still be a structurally sound building and repairable, and they can tear it down? Like, is that can the expense of what they want to do be so high that it's prohibitive for them to build this structure or to save this structure, but the structure's still okay?
The bar is pretty high, because the
So-
bar isn't just.
Well, that's my concern. I
The
don't want a
bar-
house that can stand on its own and with some work from an expert
Right.
be okay, and then you tear it down anyway.
So if you read through the criteria for demolition, the person has to, the person who wants to demolish that property has to demonstrate not just that they can't make a reasonable return on it, but nobody else can either. And that means that they demonstrate that they have sought others to
So-
redevelop the parcel, et cetera. So it's,
That's
the
my
bar is
problem when
high.
I read it, is the reasonable return. Because if you're buying a building in a national historic district, then your reasonable return, it doesn't really matter, because you own a building that is sound, mostly, maybe, or can be made sound, and you're just trying to tear it down.
The thing that you have to remember is that very often when applicants come to us, we hear poverty, well, I really can't afford to do this. And the whole point of this is to show that it's not a personal finance issue, it's an issue with the building. That the building, the building is in order to restore the building, you really, there's no economic justification for trying to restore the building. I mean, for example, if you had a shed that's on the verge of collapse, it's obvious that it really, in most instances, it doesn't make any sense to try and save it unless maybe George Washington had his horse there or Abraham Lincoln spent the night in the shed
It would have to
somewhere.
be a historical significance beyond
Right.
question.
Well, but I mean, even that example, Al, think about the Shortell Carriage House. It's
Mhm.
not the Shortell Carriage House anymore, it's somebody else. And the house that was the funeral home across the street with the Gothic carriage house that was just rehabbed by a family in the village. So it doesn't mean accessory, Al is not intending, I don't think, to say that accessory windows can be pitched out the window. I wanna pull out the language that you used, and there's a reason that it says reasonable return and not highest and best use, right? In an historic district, there is not the anticipation that a property owner will receive highest and best use for their parcel, because part of the value of the parcel and the property is the public good, which comes back to the 10th Amendment and the police power, right? The public good of the resource, balancing that against financial return. So you don't necessarily get to make highest and best use in the district, you get to have a reasonable return. So it is a little soft there's legal justification for the language being softer.
But that's one of the reasons that we're making a distinction between commercial properties that have a return on investment and the single-family home, where the return on investment is totally elusive. Okay? So if I have a single-family home, but I want to make an apartment for grandma, and the only way I can do that is by expanding this single-family home, and we were to deny a certificate of appropriateness so they go to hardship, are we creating a hardship for them? Are we creating the hardship, not a self-created hardship, okay? So it's, and with any addition on any home, there's always some demolition involved. You're always whacking off one wall at least, okay? So there's always some demolition involved in any alteration that has an addition added onto it. So it's a little dicey. It's not really cut and dried.
And the other side of this, for the protection of the property owner, is the question of, I mean, if you were to ever get to this stage, is the question of taking, right? We couldn't say to someone, you can't do anything with this property, right? Because that could constitute a taking of their economic value.
Which is the equivalent of a condemnation.
Right. So the balance is maintaining structures in a way that someone can use them reasonably, get a reasonable return, and we can maintain them as a public resource as well. We can't regulate to the point where we have completely disabled someone's capacity to enjoy the benefit of their property or to get a reasonable return. So we can't say you can never do anything with this property anywhere in the district.
Right. I mean,
Well, I'm just thinking more complete demolitions. I have no problem with, I think no one has a problem with people altering their building and making it look appropriate to the period and all that stuff, or putting an addition on if there's, if they have the zoning, and all that. But to tear something down that can be fixed is, in my opinion, that's a wrong thing to do. It's not how you handle Main Street.
right.
There's a lot of buildings on this street that can be fixed, that are not terror downers. They're really, what can be fixed is, you would be surprised. Okay, so to see something that is on the block to get taken down, when I know for a fact there's nothing wrong with it, I have a problem with that. And that's really what I'm trying to get at here, is how do you protect, what recourse do we have as a board if they want to tear down a building, and they pass the seeker and they show the hardship and they're like, all right, tear it down. But I know for a fact there's nothing wrong with the building that a competent professional couldn't take care of.
So in a case like that, someone would, if there were someone who felt that the board's decision was arbitrary and capricious, that person would appeal the decision via an Article 78 lawsuit. So we would have to then demonstrate that our decision-making around that project had been based on the facts, the merits of the application, the advice of our consultants, the information provided by the applicant, et cetera, and a judge would look at that and say, okay, these folks either base their determination on the facts of the case and with there was support for their reasoning, or the judge would say, this was not based on, this was arbitrary and capricious, go back and look at it again.
I understand what you're saying, but unless the judge is familiar with the
Well, that's how it
value and
works under the
potential of
law.
those buildings, they're gonna say, yeah, Christ, this building's 150 years old, it has a beam missing out of the middle of it, should be torn down before someone gets hurt. They have every right to tear it down,
They'll be looking at evidence,
you know?
okay? And the evidence will be essentially in a case like that, what our engineer said versus what their engineer said. And that judge might hire a third engineer.
When you say our engineer, you mean,
The person hired to consult
okay,
for the village.
the HDRB did,
Yeah.
but is that person, if their findings are, no, this building's fine, versus the people that wanna tear it down say, no, this needs to be torn down, I mean,
Then we,
Well, ultimately, we make a call on that. Basically, what Kathleen is describing is that we need to follow a procedure, and that procedure needs to be consistent. And so, as long as we are following the procedure, from what I understand, and I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand, most judges will not question the conclusion that you reached, but the process that you took in getting there. And so.
I'm sure it was legitimately followed.
exactly.
But, you know, if everybody's doing the right thing, you know, that's great, but it just seems like it could be easily manipulated by people who might not be so honest, or might have more influence on the HDRB than they should, and all of a sudden, you know, the building can be torn down when perhaps it should not have been, and when you look at all the paperwork, yes, you did everything by the book, but, you know.
Well, the thing that you have to remember, there are a lot of factors that go into it, and ultimately, you know, you have to take everything into consideration. I mean, the structural integrity or the ability of repairing a house or building is one of the considerations.
Integrity. So there's a whole list of criteria that we have to look at in addition to structural soundness. We have to look at the integrity of the building, how much it's been modified. Does it still read? Can you still read the structure as it was built? Do you understand it in its context? Or is the mitigation effort that would be made by the replacement of the structure or the modification of the structure alleviate some of the impacts? Is there benefit gained from the alleviation of the impact? That's the whole. I mean, there are lots of things. It's not just an engineer's report.
Well, I didn't know the HDRB, I thought they only considered exterior. I didn't realize that structural was part of your purview. It's not the way I understood it. I thought you were just.
Well, typically it is, but I mean, you know, when, for example, and I think you're talking about a demolition, if what the applicant is saying is that the structure itself is in poor shape, then that's something that you have to investigate.
Right, and that's not
that
the
would
five
trigger
of
the
us
secret.
walking into a building, right? That's because we're not structural engineers. That's the consultant that's been hired by the village, who is a structural engineer, to walk in and give their assessment and put their license on the stamp. Because there again, that's the question of liability for the village, right? You don't want five of us assessing whether a building is sound or not. You want a licensed professional who you're paying for and whose stamp goes down with the liability. What?
You want a certain type of licensed professional. Most engineers overbuild everything to the max because they don't want to have any issues pop up later on when something doesn't perform the way it should.
So one of the
So
things.
they're going to look at an old
yeah.
building like this and say, this isn't going to hold anything up. So it's easy to get an engineer that has that point of view. It's not easy to get one that understands
Well, one of the
the
things
age
that
of
we
law.
look at when we, in our process to hire consultants for the 3 ongoing seeker reviews is, are they just an engineering firm, or are they an engineering firm that also has, that has a deep bench that includes architectural historians who can assess significance and materials conservation issues along with the structural assessment. So one of the things that we need to look for in hiring seeker consultants is someone who has the purview and interest of the board in mind. Right? You wouldn't hire someone who you know is going to say the bond.
That's what you guys are supposed to be going after, I guess, would be my question.
Well,
Like, are you telling yourselves that through your chapter, for these edits, or whatever you wanna call them, sorry, for lack of a better word. So, the seeker gets, if someone wants to tear something down, that triggers the seeker review, or is that how you start the seeker review, essentially? So,
It's not just if somebody wants to tear something down.
no, I know that, but I'm
Concern
saying
as well.
specifically the demolition is what I'm
I think
concerned
HDRB
about.
would get involved in structural issues if it was gonna be a demo only. I don't think everything else is pretty much
Right, exterior.
exterior. Am
Okay.
I wrong with that? I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know why
no.
you would be getting into a basement and for any other reason besides they're gonna tear the building down.
Okay,
Or,
so,
or a portion of it.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
I need to keep talking or I'll forget what I was trying to say. So are you mandating to yourselves that you have to hire somebody that is an expert in the restoration of old buildings
So let me go to that
and,
section.
and knows that?
The 2 properties that we're dealing with tomorrow, the structural engineer that was retained is Robert Selman Associates. I've worked with them in the past, and I worked at Bio Bell. They're probably the premier historic preservation structural engineers in New York City.
wood frame or anything, or?
Well, anything. I mean, they have done work up and down the seaboard. They worked on Ellis Island. They worked on Falling Water. Frank Lloyd Wright's.
Falling on.
Right. And you know, they have done. That's their specialty. I think if you have concerns about these 2, then I would recommend coming tomorrow when the consultant will be giving their presentation on their findings. Because, you know, like I said, the structural integrity is
This is
one
our
aspect.
consultant you're speaking
Huh?
of. Our
The
consultant.
village consultant,
Okay.
yeah.
Just wanted to be clear.
And there are
Which
other
you all approved,
considerations.
the hiring of
Yes,
which
oh,
you
yeah.
all approved.
Right. That I remember.
On your recommendation.
Yes, but you all can read, so own it.
Oh,
I'm
all
just
about not
saying.
owning anything.
No, I'm not questioning them, I'm questioning, is it the village's goal to, or the HDRB's goal to save all these buildings? And you coming at it from that perspective and hiring
Absolutely.
those type of people, you know, and that's how it's written down.
If you read,
I don't read.
read the read the document, that is the purpose of having an historic district, is retaining as much fabric as possible. There are going to be times. The one thing that I think is really important, whatever decisions get made about, I'm not speaking about it in a particular property. I'm speaking very sort of universally here.
Right.
We have a district that is almost 40 years old. Most of the buildings have had attention in some way or another. Sometimes it's been good attention, sometimes it hasn't been. But we're getting to the point in the health and care of our district where we're starting to look at the buildings that nobody has wanted to touch before. And we're so blessed that we're at a point where people are buying little worker cottages on Market Street and, you know, run down commercial buildings on Main Street and wanting to rehab them. And so there are going to be times when we're looking at buildings that have compromised conditions, and that's one of the things that we have to look at. It's not, you know, that along with the history and along with the context and along with the public value, the other thing we have to look at is it something that is reasonable to save? Is this a building that was, you know, how was it constructed initially? We have to look at all of that stuff. It's never a there's no one switch that flips that decision making. Does anybody else want to?
Well, I'll give you an example. I'll give the board a heads up. I plan on, at some point, applying to demolish the garden shed that I have. And
There are no sheds allowed.
and I'll tell you, there is absolutely nothing historic about it. It is very poor construction. I have let it slide and it's falling apart. So structurally, there's.
demolition plan, correct?
Well,
I think it could be.
is it gonna be a secret one?
Adjacent to the water.
But, you know, there, ultimately, what our board is, the main objective of our board is to preserve as much historic fabric as possible. And that's the key, you know, not every building is historic. There is a lot of historic fabric. The definition of a district is that it's a collection of buildings of a certain period, you know, which exemplify the styles of that period. But it isn't 100%. There are other structures within the district who really are non-contributing, don't reflect that prevailing era that we're looking at, and so therefore they're not as important to preserve at all costs. And that's the part that we look at, is that does the building or how important is it to the district? And then, you know, that's where we start. And then we look at the condition and what the applicant wants to do. Because ultimately, as much as possible, we try to accommodate the applicant. I mean, these are people who are living in these buildings, they have a financial investment, and, you know, they want to be able to live there. And very often, a lot of the additions that we talked about are ways that they're modifying the building so that they can live in it. There are a lot of buildings in Cold Spring that have very old utilities and features which you would, you know, really is a little bit of a difficulty for people to live in, but they do anyway because it is a historic building. But, you know, it goes back to the argument that there are a lot of factors that we have to look at, and the structural integrity of a building is only one of them. You know, and one of the very important things is, what does the applicant want to do? We try to accommodate them as much as possible while preserving as much historic fabric as we can.
I just want to bring up one other thing. The current village attorney and the immediately prior village attorney both recognize the fact that HDRB had agency status for the purpose of secret. Two prior village attorneys to them said, no, you're just ministerial. You just tick off boxes on a form. You're nobody, okay? You've got no voice in secret, no standing, all right? And that's one of the reasons why we lost Butterfield Hospital. That building was solid. It was needed work, needed a lot of work. That building was solid. The original 1922 building, the 1940s edition, pardon my French, but it was built like a brick shit house. The 1960s edition kind of messed up the whole thing, in my opinion. Other people disagreed and thought it was great. But there was no reason why that building could not have been reused for housing, okay? We got overridden. We did a huge amount of research and showed the historic value of that building. But we didn't have the tools and we didn't have the standing to do anything about it. And plus, there was an administration in place at the time that basically told us to go to hell also. Okay? I think with the tool of SECRA, that we have another tool to save more buildings, more stuff, more fabric in the village, and I'm glad we do.
Oh, I agree. I'm not arguing that. I just want more. I see an old building and I say, why in the hell would you tear this thing down unless you fell through the floor when you walked in the door? And that could be fixed too. So there's no reason to
to tear a lot of these things down.
Look at the Grove. When Steve Marino bought that building,
You did
there
fall through the floor.
literally
Yeah.
were holes in the floor.
I've been
that you
doing it
could
for
fall.
20 years. I'm an expert in old buildings.
Well, I think
And the stuff that I have dealt with would blow your mind. And then now there's 6 families living in some of these buildings. So
What can I say?
there's nothing that can't be repaired if it's made out of wood, and even, even brick buildings as well.
But you know something?
So-
Anything can be prepared if you're willing to throw enough money at it.
Well, it's an old
Yeah.
building, and if you buy it, that you should have to do that, is what I'm saying. If you don't wanna, if you have a crappy house in the middle of a fish kill or whatever that was built in the 60s, I don't really care what you do with that. But if you had a National Historic Site, Main Street, and you're tearing a building down, there's nothing wrong with it, then I have a problem with that. I just don't, and I'm concerned about this.
What's the monetary, where do we go? Just, like, I know we should, I mean, you say you're working with the applicant or whatever, but if an applicant comes in and buys a place that they wanna use commercially, or for whatever reason, and they have visions of doing something, and they say, okay, half the foundation's not good, and some of these beams are rotted out, in this case, that's gonna cost us $40,000 or $100,000. That's not the end of the world,
what I
but
would really like
where
for
would
you all
that
to do,
consideration be?
what I'd really like for you all to do, we have 3 cases before us right now that involve demolition in one way or another. This is not anything that anyone on this board takes lightly at all. And we've been working on these cases for months. With all due respect, no one has been in our meeting room. So if you have concerns, please come hear what we're talking about with the applicants, the things we're deliberating, the things we're weighing. Nobody takes it lightly. And we put our heart and souls, we are getting the facts that we need. And I'd love for you to come in and see how that process works and the conversations that happen.
And
I have
all
no
the
doubt
meeting
it's-
videos are on YouTube, so you can catch up before you come.
That's not really what I'm questioning. I'm sorry if it feels like I'm saying you guys suck or something. I'm not. I'm saying that
That's
there's just not enough of that. I've been all over one of the buildings you're talking about. There is nothing wrong with that building,
So
and
no
they're talking about
decisions have
tearing it
been
down.
made.
So I
So
don't know.
I think that
You know.
your point is taken, and just to add an anecdotal point to it as well, I would say 75% of the new building owner, new residents who are moving into the village from elsewhere that come before our board tell us that they didn't know they were buying a house in a historic district until they got a referral to our board. So there is perhaps a marketing issue
Yeah.
in the village, particularly among the people who are selling houses and marketing houses in the village, that the
Full disclosure, not taken.
disclosure of being in a historic district, being in a state historic district, and being in a local historic district is just not part of the conversation. So if there was any way of encouraging that, if there was any way of enforcing that to be, part of a contract of sale for a building in the historic district, that could really help.
I would also say, buyer beware. When you're buying
I
a
agree, buyer
property,
beware.
you should investigate.
Every building
what the
that's
local
listed
codes are
for
and
sale,
so-
it says in historic Cold Spring, but none of the realtors ever seem to remind people that means it's in a historic district.
You would think it would have to be part of the disclosure along with the septic and all the other stuff.
I think a lot of things.
Sorry, septic, disclosure of septic, you can say you have septic, that doesn't mean you're connected to it. Sorry, you can say you have village sewer, that doesn't mean that you're
Right,
connected
in the town
to
you
it.
can say it, right?
No, I'm
Not the
saying
house.
in the village. In the village, you can say, everyone has access to the village sewer, not everyone is connected
Not
to it,
everyone's connected,
as
right?
I unfortunately found out.
Well,
Okay.
something that I think,
Full disclosure.
I hope, looking to the big picture and long term, I hope you're getting a sense of, this board has been working so hard for 2 years on bringing up the capacity and the functionality and the quality of our baseline documents and access, right? Looking at the application, looking at the ordinance, looking at the design standards. all of the things that Sean's talking about are that's the really important stuff that we wish we could get to and we want to get to, which is the public education aspect, which I think is very much part of a mission, is to teach people what it means to live in a district and care. It's out there. People believe in the district. They buy in it. They care for it. But what about those who don't? How do we bring them into the circle? Now that we've really done the hard work, rolled up our sleeves, and worked on these documents with your support, and thank you, we can get to that next level, which I think is a much more public service oriented level than we've been able to deliver in the past.
I'm sorry, I skipped over one comment.
Oh, Marie.
I already closed my computer,
It's
man.
closed.
I know I said I was, and this is the key one, 64-6L. This is the statement that it is not the intent to reduce the size but to enlarge it.
It isn't.
Pardon?
It isn't the intent to reduce the size of the historic district.
That was carried over,
It is not the-
that had
this-
been, it's in our old, it was,
It's old language.
And it's also part of the model ordinance.
Yeah, I just,
And
I
it's
have
also
a
true.
problem with that. That
Why, Marie? Why? Why do you have a problem with that?
I do not believe that the people who do not live in the
So that's why you have a public hearing. That's what has to happen.
So, we're giving you our feedback.
Yes, but I'm trying to help you understand that I believe that you are basing that statement on one issue and one hearing that you heard as part of comp plan. You keep referring to a meeting on a Saturday morning at the VFW.
Saturday afternoon.
Saturday afternoon. I thought you said 8 a.m. last time.
Huh?
Let the
We
record
never
So-
did.
show.
We
Let the
never
record
had
show.
an 8 a.m.
So none of this can happen without public consent. And any time that there is a proposal to nominate, to designate an individual landmark or to expand the district, that has to go before the public, and the public gets its voice. Just because 10 people at one meeting on a Saturday morning / afternoon had one opinion doesn't mean that 10 years from now, another set of people might not have a different set of concerns. And so the ordinance needs to have the capacity and the enabling authority to let that happen.
And the statement about delineation permits that. You have multiple statements about delineation, expanding the boundaries. It's the statement of intent here that is.
Why does that have to be in there one way
Think
or
about
the
this
other?
logically. If you're looking at building every 50 years, more things are achieving historical significance. It stands to reason that over time, the boundaries of your district will change to accommodate things that achieve
It
significance.
doesn't have to say that it's your intention to expand it or
So what would you like it to say?
say
Just
it's
do
to
it, strike it.
destruct. It doesn't have to say either way.
But I have to say that it is our intention to increase it.
Yeah,
And
but
why?
yours is a historic district review board, it may not be the intention of everyone else.
Well, that's
But
what the
this
ordinance
is,
is
the
for.
ordinance is for our board.
And that's why you have public hearings.
And that's why you have
So-
public
And I would
hearings.
imagine that anybody who would be joining this board with the intention to decrease the
I'm not-
boundaries of the district is
I'm-
joining the
I'm
board
not
in bad
suggesting-
faith.
I'm not suggesting to decrease. I'm suggesting to strike the statement.
But
And
I feel, my opinion is it's a historic board, and I think they are so involved in it that I think it should be their intent to expand it. I don't have to agree with that, and it would come.
And it
to
doesn't
us.
necessarily mean we would be successful in doing it, but if it's.
I can't tell you how many times I've had people say, why isn't the other end of Parrott Street designated?
And the other-
Most of which is older than the upper part of Parrott Street.
And the people in Parrott Street were represented at that /morning.
So,
afternoon.
Marie, if no one has done it, P.S., made a nomination for that portion of Parrott Street. We keep talking about that block of Parrott Street like it's in contention. No one's made a nomination for it. If someone were to make a Joe Smith makes a nomination for that portion of the district, they would have to justify the reasons why. Our board would have to research on our own and understand all of how all of the criteria for designation apply to the application. Then we would have to have a public hearing. We would have to vote to move that nomination forward, and then the trustees have the vote for yes or no, whether or not it happens. You have the option to hold your own public hearing at that point. So ain't nobody expanding the boundaries without everybody having something to say about it.
Okay,
But your ordinance wants to reflect the capacity in the law.
so, thank you. I really have no more comments.
Say that half hour ago.
For now.
Well, I guess the question is that, what is the process from this point
That's
forward?
where I was going. So the intent of this session was to review the board's comments with the HDRB. And again, thank you very much. The changes to the ordinance are really, really good, and it is obvious that you spent significant time and thought in making those changes. It would seem to me that the next step is for the village board to schedule a public hearing.
I would think we should talk to our attorney as was requested and get those two areas which you had questioned straightened out before we have a public hearing without
Okay.
those, reflected in the changes. So if we can get to that tomorrow or very soon
I
or
will-
whatever,
I
I'd
will
be
send-
glad to,
I
but
will
I think
send
you
it-
understand
I will send the
since
comments
it's your
off to
question.
John.
And then we get the answers from John, how to kind of clear up those, there were two
I think they're-
sections.
And do you want me to take Marie and someone else made recommendations tonight for language changes?
Mhm.
Shall I make them first and give
Yeah.
you a clean copy
Yes.
and that's what you take to John?
Yes,
Okay,
or why don't you wait for us to get back from what John,
whatever he wants.
yes, and then we could send that to you, we can make all clear changes for all.
Yeah, sure.
And then we, a meeting, we call a public hearing. Once we get that.
At the public hearing, do you want a presentation of the ordinance?
What we would have to have, if I may, we would have to have copies of the proposal, of the proposed new language. We would have to have a copy here in the village office. I would propose that there be a copy placed up at Butterfield, we've done that in the past, of the proposed new language for chapter 64. We may also want to put it online as a proposal and on the village website. And then it would seem to me that as an introduction to the public hearing, you would go through and highlight what the changes are.
Well, the reason I'm asking the question is because I know, and I think the last time we talked, Jeff talked about having the old code and where the new code changes, but we changed the structure so much that I don't know if that's really, that would be
Doable.
understandable.
Well, I mean, we could take a stab. I'm willing to take a stab at it because even if it's not, when we looked at things, it was obvious that it would make more sense to order a number of things differently. However, it would be helpful, I think, to a person who's never seen it before, to see a comparison of the table of contents, to see where the big changes happened, and then in some sections where there had been the most dramatic changes, not dramatic, but the most substantive changes, thank you, to do a side by side. They could just be two columns on a paper. I mean, it's not going to look all that pretty, but that could be an option as a document.
You could
Hmm?
rather than doing that as a document and trying, could we do it as a PowerPoint? And at the public hearing, show it on the screen as you're explaining the changes, and then we could post something of your PowerPoint presentation on the website or on the Facebook page or something. I think doing it as a document gets a little bit more of this, all over the place with the pages.
That's true. I mean, I'd have to go back and look
Right.
to see how chunky. I mean, it would be a very chunky PowerPoint with paragraphs. I mean, it may be helpful to have to project a table of contents, and I don't know. I have to look at it.
I think that the most efficient way for anyone to take away I mean, you just have to read the whole thing, but we could pull out the significant alterations that were made and highlight them. One big thing was that there was inconsistencies about the timing between public hearings and answers to public hearing. There were a lot of things that just weren't consistent with the document.
What I was going to suggest, there were a set of reasons why you did this.
Mm-hmm.
Timing might have been one. Bring it up to New York State Fire Protection Code, whatever.
Right.
There were certain objectives that you had
Mhm.
when you set out to come up with the new chapter 64. Maybe you lead in with that. Here are the things that drove you in making these changes, and then
And
here
who we
are
consulted with. right?
Yeah,
Who's named in on it.
here are these are the major areas or sections that were changed. When the Code Update Committee did their, public meeting, we received criticism for doing the side-by-side comparison.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which I thought was so helpful.
Mhm.
What was suggested instead was to take the old text and highlight or italicize and.
Oh my God, at this point,
It's
that would
an
be,
entirely
that would be a
different-
job,
I
Yeah.
agree with you.
like a 40-hour-a-week job.
Yeah, so I'm thinking side-by-side would be easier. And it's particularly if you reorganize things,
Mhm.
side-by-side gets really tough.
Well, I think side by side, as far as the table of contents, to sort of explain
It's a
how
map.
you move stuff.
Mhm.
And then maybe focus in on the certain important changes. But just a side by side, it wouldn't be possible because you'd be jumping back and forth on one of them.
How many people do you think have ever read chapter 64?
Exactly 0.
Well,
So-
5.
5.
So side-by-side.
6, 7, 8.
And John.
Side-by-side doesn't make any, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If you've never
that's
read
true.
it, it doesn't help. So if you just present, here's the new 64.
Right.
I think
Highlight
that
the
would-
Here's why it's different.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and in the packet,
Here's why it's
the
better.
online packet and the packet that you create to have, you have one set available for the public, if you will need to have a copy of the existing chapter, a copy of the proposed, the 2 tables of contents,
Mhm.
if somebody really wants to spend time going through, you're gonna need to flip through the document. There's just no shortcut to that. We'll make it as easy as possible, and we'll consult with you to get it right. Whatever we need to do, but I think that side by side would, it's just gonna be a lot. We'll do our best.
All right, so Kathleen will prepare the presentation, PowerPoint presentation of ours. Anyway.
Good, Kathleen.
Sean and I will do PowerPoint. I'm not a PowerPoint.
I
Is
only
he
use
not out?
InDesign.
What? What'd you say?
I said I only use InDesign.
We have a meeting next Tuesday.
What are we talking about timing wise?
That's what I was gonna
Because
like.
it's gonna
we
take
have
time for me to do
projectors?
that.
Does the village have a PowerPoint
closing it.
projector?
Oh, okay.
Do we?
So we can, at our
I can
next,
get a projector.
if we get all the information to you, whatever, we can call it, we're meeting next Tuesday. Can we kind of clear things up a little by then, do you think? And then call it, and then set the public hearing next Tuesday?
So what is your expectation that I would be handing
Well, I
to
guess we're
you
already-
by next Tuesday?
I would ask Marie to get clear up. Marie's going to talk to John because of her questions that she has problems with that he's gonna clear up.
Okay?
So those paragraphs will be,
But note that those places where we suggested
Yes,
that you all,
yes,
we suggested
yes.
too.
okay, so
It's not my fault.
not totally, but so if she talks to John and we get the information, and then if she gets that back to you, and we
Uh-huh.
can incorporate that in a clean document
Yep,
with the other little change, whatever the other word changes were, or whatever that you said
Mhm.
you're gonna clear up, and you could send those to us,
yep.
or we can have them to review for next Tuesday,
Mhm.
and, if you get it to them before that, or if you wanna wait 2 weeks, I don't know, you tell me.
What would be useful for me, I'm just putting this out for everybody, is for me to make the changes that, the small things that you've talked about tonight, have you get the feedback that you need from the village attorney on sections, put it all into a fresh, clean document, have colleagues look at it again to make sure I haven't missed anything, and then hand it to you. So, can you give us 2 weeks? Because we're also
Yeah,
working
whatever
on
you
design
want. I'll give
standards
you,
and
like,
3
2
seeker
years.
projects right now.
Whatever.
Okay.
I just wanna keep it rolling, so whatever works for you, and you get that back to us, the clean document, we review it, we set the public hearing.
What's your, you meet on, your
13th.
monthly meeting is the 13th. Do you meet on the 6th is next week already, right?
Mhm.
Alright, so if we aim to get that to you by the 13th, by your, no, it would have to be to you by the 9th. So it's part of your packet, right?
Yeah, if we had a little bit of time to look at it, it's always good. Or if you wanna have it the following week, we usually don't have a meeting there, but I know my board loves that meeting.
Well, if we aim to get it to you by the
But how
9th,
much notice do you have to have for a public hearing?
oh, to a chunk.
Oh, we'd have to, I forget what it is. It's,
Probably at least hearing in mid-March, maybe.
Yeah.
We need 2 weeks.
But if we get it to you on the 9th, you all can look at it and decide whether you think it's ready to include on your agenda on the 13th or not.
If you get it before that, we can
I'm
read it. and
aiming to
go
get
over
it
whatever
earlier then.
changes there are that you made.
Okay. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
look at the things we have to balance with our own workload in the next
How
couple
much
weeks.
time do you think it will take for a public hearing on
What do
To
you mean?
prepare for one?
this? No, to conduct it.
Like 2 hours, hour.
Depends on how much the public has to say, I don't know. What has been your experience with
Depends on
other
whether
local
it's
law
snowing that
change?
night.
Is it snowing or not?
Local
What's
law
your,
local law changes are trivial,
How
Well,
many
this
people
isn't-
showed up for your last CUC meeting?
25.
now how long did that take?
An hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half, something like that.
Questions aside, like how long was the presentation itself? Like, if you could just buzz through it and then if the questions
Well,
are
I
what
think
they
the
are.
shorter the
7
better.
minutes.
Yeah, because no one's gonna want to sit and their eyes are gonna glaze over.
Yeah. I think that you want the audience awake when you finish. So I
Maybe.
would think,
That's a good goal.
yeah, I would think,
Sleeping audiences are good sometimes.
yeah, I think that you probably wouldn't want it any longer than 15 to 20 minutes.
Oh my God, I'm thinking 10.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think 7.
7. That's the goal.
Do we have a projector screen?
Are we talking about in this room?
Well, that was where I was going,
I don't know, do you?
No idea.
because if we
You
don't,
could
this
project it on the wall.
is not a good place to have,
You have anything like that? See anything
a
like
PowerPoint
Screen around?
presentation.
I mean, I'm
Don't
sure
see
we
any.
can,
Okay, no.
a projector I can get hands on, but I don't know about a
Have we
screen.
definitely decided or
Where's
to
that,
go
it's a
PowerPoint?
stand, never mind.
Stand,
I think that if you're gonna
That's
give a
not-
presentation, you either have 2 alternatives. Either you have a whole bunch of people hand out copies of it and walk them through it, which I think increases the chances of them falling asleep, or you do a PowerPoint.
Maybe we can take the pictures up there.
I think
You
if,
could- you could do it there.
Yeah.
It's not a good room for it,
So the firehouse.
because you have to project here, so these are your only people, and the projector would have to be here, right, so that you can get up and over.
It's
well,
up
how
to
about
you.
on the table projecting on that wall?
You have to take the stuff down,
Yeah.
project on any of the
Right.
walls in there.
Or we do the firehouse.
No, the firehouse projector doesn't work, so we have to get a projector.
I'll
We
take
can
on getting a projector. You decide where you want it.
get- We can get a projector. I got one for the code of meeting.
No biggie. You all decide where you want it.
We could project right on that wall.
Then we would have to take the clock down. Is that a gold clock? Is
It's
that, is
historical.
that a C battery in it, or is that 2 Ds?
I changed the battery in it, so I know that it's not permanently fixed.
Is it an Everready or
You had enough finally? Okay.
Yes.
I was hoping somebody would do that.
Is there any questions in the audience before we wrap up tonight? Fred, you've endured. Are your eyes
I've done
glazed
a lot.
over?
Please, Mr. Mayor and Board of Trustees, I'm Fred Martin, President of Little Stony Point Citizens Association. We're your neighbor just to the north that volunteering for the state park. And as you know, and thank you for your support of our grant application to build a volunteer center. I sent a mail, I think on Thursday, so it didn't make the packet, but basically, we have a safety fence around the construction, which is, proceeding apace. But it was suggested maybe something sturdier would be better. I looked into it, it's very expensive, especially, kind of on a shoestring budget that we are. Someone suggested when we were asking around to borrow from the Butterfield site, that there might be panels at the village garage. And I asked a friend who worked there, he said there are about 200 feet of fence panels stored there that used to be around the Loretto Rest. And my request is if you could borrow those for maybe a month or two. Pretty sure it would be done in 2 months, and or permission to ask the highway department chief if
Did
they
Jeff
could be
talk to you
spared.
today?
Sorry?
Did Jeff contact you today?
No, sorry.
Oh, I had this conversation with him and I contacted Charlie, so talk to Charlie.
Excellent. That's
Sorry you
okay.
sat through this on my behalf.
I
I was
thought
gonna
that
ask you when
uh,
you first sat down if you had something, 'cause
Oh, no, I didn't hear from them, so,
Yeah,
I'll call Charlie.
Charlie, just talk to Charlie.
I
Some at the
still, I still
treatment
learned
plant,
a lot.
Aren't there some at the treatment plant also, Mayor?
What's that?
There's some at the treatment plant also.
Yeah, that might be where it's at, yeah.
There's just a pile of them
Right.
against the wall.
Well, thank you, I appreciate it, and if they're needed, we'll bring them right back.
Okay, yeah, I think that was the only thing I said, to make sure that, you know, if we need them, you guys get them to us, and we don't have to go take them down.
Very good, I appreciate that.
Alright. Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
Second,
All in favor?
Hi.
aye.
5 minutes past.
Thank you, everybody.
5 minutes past 9:30.
Hey, Stephanie.
Okay, down.